All right, I think we have a solid number of people here, so we'll go ahead and get started and people can continue to trickle in. And so today we are starting the State Resilience Index, a project that is supported by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And we're very appreciative that there's the support. And we are so thrilled to be able to debut this for our audience today. This has been a project over 2 years in the making, and that we have quite an impressive dashboard, if I do say so myself, to debut to you all today. And to start us off on this launch, I will hand the mic over to our esteemed board chair, George Lehrer.
Thanks, Emily. And on behalf of the Board of Directors at the Fund for Peace, I do want to welcome everyone to this global launch of the State Resilience Index, and thank you all for joining. It was about, I think, 5 years ago, I was in the Zurich airport waiting for a flight to Nairobi, where we had been invited to meet with government officials and local community groups to facilitate a conversation about the Fragile State Index. I was reading our report in preparation for that meeting when a young man sitting next to me pointed to the report and said, "Oh, that thing." As you might imagine, it started a conversation, and I learned that he was a student at the university in Addis Ababa in political science, and that he and a group of friends had used the data that we had released in the Fragile State Index to prepare what he described was a petition to the government. I'm not sure whatever really happened to that petition, but I have often thought about that encounter, and it reminded me, and still does, of how interconnected we are, how powerful the internet has become, and that what we believe, and that we all believe that data and facts and figures have a real power to persuade. And indeed that what we do and that we have done at the Fragile State, with the Fragile State Index and at the Fund for Peace, can have ripples that we never really see or appreciate. At the Fund for Peace, we focus our efforts on using data-driven methodologies and innovative technology coupled with local law knowledge to work with civil society, community groups, government, and the private sector to better understand and to reduce the causes of conflict. That work has really helped us to understand that one of the most important elements of building an enduring peace is to ensure that our communities are in fact resilient. And so, as Emily said, for the last 2 years, we have been working to build a tool that we believe will help us build resilience in our local communities, our states, the regions in which we live, all in what is an increasingly interconnected and fragile global community. As Emily said, the result of this effort has been the State Resilience Index, as well as a companion tool, the Crisis Simulation Indicator, which we will hear about much more today. But this work has been a real collaborative effort, and I want to thank all our partners in this endeavor, notably SAS and its work on the crisis simulator, the Georgetown University Center on Women, Peace, and Security, our colleagues at the Alliance for Peace Building, the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, our research team of research assistants and interns at the Fund for Peace, and there are many others I could mention as well. But last and most generously, again, as Emily mentioned, I want to thank the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and its president, Vilas Dar, who has provided the support without which we would be here today. I could spend a good part of the morning introducing Vilas, his background, what he has done in the past. It is significant. Far more important than what he has done is what he and the McGovern Foundation are doing now. Under his leadership, the McGovern Foundation has made a deep commitment to helping us understand how data, technological innovation, advances in artificial intelligence can all be used to help create equitable and sustainable communities for all. It's a vision that we share at the Fund for Peace, and we are privileged to have the support of the McGovern Foundation in this effort. So thank you again. And with that, I would like to welcome and introduce Vilas Dar for some opening remarks. Thank you for being here, Vilas.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, George. And I really am very excited to be here today with the Fund for Peace. Let me start, though, with a very clear-eyed realism. I've spent the last week really between Brussels and Washington, D.C., at the European Parliament, at NATO, here with our defense establishment. And it's important to acknowledge that we convene today under the shadow of war, that even as we come out of a global pandemic and face really a significant risk of economic disruption, the world also faces conflict in a way that I think for many of us 5 years or 10 years ago seemed quite so far away. I share that with you and I ground ourselves there because as we think about these fundamental questions of security, of resilience, and of fragility, it seems that these issues become more relevant by the day, and yet our responses remain the same. That often the policymakers we speak with are trying to do their very best with limited resources, with limited insight, with limited understanding and granularity. And so there perhaps comes the moment of optimism and inspiration. George, as you spoke to, the idea that data can give us greater depth and nuance in our policymaking is a fundamental bedrock. I think goes back hundreds of years, if not more. But what we're seeing, I think, is the end of a first generation of advocacy where institutions like ours and yours have called for greater data, to now instead a moment where what matters more than data is insight. That data can often become overwhelming, that the raw information about the world around us in a fundamentally more interconnected world begins to lose meaning when you have so much of it. But this question of data to insight seems particularly well cited for the moment of technological revolution in which we live. The idea that we can bring significant computing power, significant algorithmic design, and maybe much more importantly than any of that, the collected knowledge and wisdom of organizations in the field who are working at the front lines of vulnerability, to develop new tools and insights that help policymakers understand with greater granularity and clarity, but also with greater empathy, the condition of those that they work to support and to guide and to develop policy for. Today's launch of the fragility states of the State Resilience Index, of the crisis simulator, of the continuing work of the Fragile States Index, to me is the perfect moment to really address that question. The idea that these new tools are not merely a point in time where we begin to look at the world and say, this is what happens today, but instead empower policymakers, NGOs, civil society, even foundations like ours to make better decisions about how we allocate resources, to respond to threats both existing today and perceived in the future, to position resources and to build human capacity to deal with the challenges of tomorrow. These are the kinds of products that we should be working on across the sector. And so let me end then just with one call and exhortation that even as we launch tools like this, it requires a commitment not merely from organizations like the Fund for Peace, but from an ecosystem of actors to ensure that these tools both are kept current and alive, but also that they represent those areas of the world that maybe are not yet so data mature yet. That the global majority is truly represented not merely in the data, but in the algorithms and the ways that we design our risk assessments, the ways that we think about the interconnectedness of global policy, and that we cite and ensure that even as tools like this change human and political behavior, we're centering human equity at the center of the outcomes. Thanks for these few minutes to share a few thoughts. And let me just share again how excited I am for the work of the Fund for Peace generally, for today's launch, and for the work that will come ahead as this ecosystem comes forward to promote peace and security in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vilas, for your comments and for your continued support. I now have the pleasure of introducing Nate Hagen. Nate Hagen is the Vice President for Research and Innovation here at the Fund for Peace and has been a driving force behind both our Fragile States Index and this new State Resilience Index. And he will be able to take the opportunity here to share the highlights and some of our major achievements in this index going forward. Nate?
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you, Vilas and George, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. I'm very excited that we've arrived at the launch after 2 years of work on this, and just wanted to underline some of the things that have already been said and just kind of give some highlights of some of the key findings from this first annual edition of the State Resilience Index. So there have been many, many miscalculations, of course. After over $2 trillion and 21 years, Afghanistan was much less resilient than anybody hoped. And another miscalculation, despite being invaded by one of the world's largest militaries, Ukraine ended up being much more resilient than most people anticipated. And much closer to home, the US was expected to be the best prepared country in the world to confront a pandemic, but ended up being so much less resilient than anybody would have imagined. The Fund for Peace has been producing the Fragile States Index for 17 years. But from those examples and many others, it's clear that we need a new frame to more fully capture these complexities. Because in just looking at country risk through the lens of fragility alone, we're obviously missing something very important. And we'd better figure it out quick, because the intensity and the frequency of global shocks is increasing. And we need to know how to better position countries to manage and recover from those shocks. As we've seen over the last few years and over many years before that, a strong military, lots of money, lots of doctors, lots of engineers, lots of machinery, lots of technology, all that stuff is very important, but it isn't enough. Rather, we need a focus on resilience and a localization agenda that takes context and local capacities and local capabilities and local systems into account. It's not enough to have a booming economy if there's a high dependency on a single monocrop, a single trading partner, a single commodity export, or a single authority figure. Because if that's the case, then one targeted strike can be destabilizing. Rather, what's needed for resilience are things like social, economic, political inclusion, solidarity, civic space, diversification, environmental, ecological resilience, and other things like that, that are very hard to measure, I might add. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the great work being done by others in this space, including the Islamic Development Bank, the African Development Bank, ECOWAS, the University of Notre Dame, many others. But this index, the State Resilience Index, it tries to fill a vital gap in a way that talks directly to the Fragile States Index for a kind of parallax that renders depth for prognosis and planning. At first glance, the State Resilience Index appears largely to be the inverse of the Fragile States Index in terms of rank, with Scandinavian countries performing best overall on both indices, and fragile and conflict-affected countries like Yemen, South Sudan, Syria, Chad, and Somalia performing worst overall. However, what this tool does, when layered against the Fragile States Index, is to surface some very useful insights for response planning. For example, even fragile countries, like those on the far end of the index, may have areas of relative strength that can be built upon for a resilient strategy. And even stable countries may have hidden vulnerabilities that need to be shored up for a more resilient future, because those hidden vulnerabilities can cascade and compound if a shock makes a direct hit. A couple examples. Somalia is very fragile, of course, but it has developed some very innovative strategies for access to finance in situations of humanitarian crisis through networks, remittances, and mobile money, which comes out very strongly in this index. And the United States, which has a very strong score in one of the indicators that we use for the resilience index, Civic Space, it has a very strong score in Civic Space. However, it has a relatively weak score in social cohesion. So instead of a place for debate, dialogue, and consensus building, that public square, which is very robust, turns into a gladiator's arena. I think Twitter these days is perhaps a good example of that. I have not deleted my Twitter account yet, but it's been tempting over the past months or so. Anyways, so fragility is not definitionally the inverse of resilience. In fact, a crisis can even promote resilience in the long run. Many have pointed to the Ebola crisis in West Africa as being a catalyst for the development of community health structures that have boded well for an effective response to COVID-19, for example, or the Indian Ocean typhoon driving innovation in disaster preparedness in Indonesia. This is the first year of the index. It will certainly evolve over the next few years as we get feedback from users and as we learn more from how countries respond to current and future crises. In 2020, we learned a lot from the pandemic. In 2022 and 2021, we learned a lot from the crises in Afghanistan and Ukraine, all of which has impacted on the framework that you'll see presented here today. And we'll surely continue to learn in the coming years. With the generous support of the McGovern Foundation, we have conducted a series of roundtables and consultations with resilience experts to think through this framework. Then from there, we developed pillars and sub-pillars and started crunching all the numbers. And as John Madden, our intrepid data science and technology associate will demonstrate, we looked at 190 separate metrics from dozens of public sources and scaled and normalized and weighted and aggregated and mapped them to the sub-pillar and pillar scores you'll see on the dashboard. Then, as an initial validation, we conducted field research in India, Brazil, and Ethiopia to ground truth and contextualize the findings, because at the end of the day, as Vilas underlined, context is extremely important for properly interpreting these results. Finally, we developed resilience case studies with our partners that you can read about in our first annual report about resilience in Ukraine, resilience in Iraq, Lebanon, Myanmar, Brazil, Ghana, Ethiopia, as well as thematic analysis on gender and resilience, and another one on environmental resilience. We hope that this tool will be useful for humanitarian actors and development practitioners as they seek to respond to crisis and create a more resilient world. Thank you so much. And I'd like to turn it over now to John for a demonstration of the tool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nate, for that introduction. I will just get set on sharing my dashboard here. Give me one moment. Okay. Nate or Emily, can you confirm that my screen is being shared?
It's up, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so I will be providing you with a little demonstration on how to operate our dashboards, as well as a case study and an explanation of how the State Resilience Index connects to our crisis sensitivity simulator. As Nate mentioned, the State Resilience Index total score represents an average of our 7 resilience pillars, which include, as you can see here, civic space, economy, environment and ecology, inclusion, individual capabilities, social cohesion, and state capacity. Those 7 resilience pillars are composed of 40 sub-pillars and 190 metrics. We have created many different ways for you to visualize the State Resilience Index. The first is a heat map. I'm going to have to refresh the dashboard here so that we can operate it. The first visualization that we've created is a heat map where you can see countries color-coded by their scores, as well as filter the dashboard to view it filtered by different pillar scores. So if I was interested in economy, I could filter the map by using the drop-down menu above to view how states compare on the index based on their individual pillars. The second visualization that we've created for the index is the sub-pillars bar chart, which allows you to immediately determine a country's strongest or weakest sub-pillars of resilience and understand what's driving its overall score. Similarly, you can select a country in the sub-pillars bar chart. You can also select the y-axis to either sort ascending or descending, and you can observe the names of the sub-pillars driving the country's score at the bottom. The third dashboard that we've created to visualize the index is the global data dashboard, which plainly displays country scores by their pillars. The fourth and possibly most important dashboard is our dynamic dashboard, which allows you to conduct country analysis and derive targeted insights at a more granular level. If I wanted to run a case study with a country like the United States, I would select it in the drop-down menu. Notice that it populates in the map, and I would select it in the map as that selection function filters or highlights the country in the pillars scores by country chart, so you can see how it performs against others, and in the total score bar chart below. That function is also a critical step. Selecting the map, the country in the map is also a critical step as it filters subsequent dashboards for deeper analysis. So now that I have selected the United States, I would observe how it compares to other countries in the total scores chart. You can see its relative performance here, as well as see its exact score by hovering over it and viewing the tooltip that pops up. Additionally, I would look at its pillar scores by country. As we can see, the United States performs well across almost all pillars of resilience, except for environment and ecology and social cohesion, which, as you can see, are very close to the global averages as indicated by the black line. I'm interested in social cohesion, so I would click on that category, which takes me to its sub-pillar dashboard. As you can see here, we are now looking at a map that is color-coded by the total resilience score, with the United States selected, indicating that our filter has worked and that we are now viewing the sub-pillars that compose the social cohesion score. Looking at the sub-pillars, we can observe what is driving the United States' lower relative score in social cohesion. Here we can see that confidence in national institutions is pulling the United States' score down in social cohesion. If I didn't know what that meant, I could hover over this bar and get a comprehensive definition. This insight rings true in terms of what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the political controversies that the United States has seen in recent years. If I wanted to conduct another country analysis, I would simply click the return to dashboard function and reset the dashboard by selecting a new country and performing the same steps over. Now that we know how to drive insight from the interactive dashboards, I'm going to show you how to operate our brand new crisis sensitivity simulator and explain how it connects to our indices. By the way, both of these are hosted on our website currently. The crisis sensitivity simulator, which we're reviewing now, was developed in partnership with SAS Institute's Data for Good initiative. The simulator leverages a country's capacities as demonstrated in the State Resilience Index and pressures as demonstrated by the Fragile States Index to flag areas of vulnerability in the case of a shock. If we look at the United States, if we wanted to look at the United States, we could select it in the drop-down menu. And observe its relative position. Apologies. We could select it in the drop-down menu and observe its relative position in the overall resilience under current pressures visualization. As we can see here, the United States is highlighted in purple and farther to the right of this chart, which indicates greater resilience as it is positive. This positive positioning of the United States indicates that its capacities are greater than its pressures. If a country's capacities were if a country's pressures were greater than their capacities, it would appear somewhere in the negative area of the chart. So now that I've applied the filter to select the United States, we can see how it would perform in the case of a high shock. So I'd go down here to the degree of shock indicators drop-down menu, select high, and observe how the box plots below have changed. If we take, for example, the cohesion indicators box plot and enlarge it, we can see through we can understand how the United States would respond in the case of high degree shocks in the following categories and compare it to the baseline box plot. All gray box plots on this dashboard indicate the spectrum of scenarios if there was no shock applied to the United States. So here we can see that if a shock to the United States was applied in factionalized elites, there would be a greater leftward shift in the country's overall performance on this tool, as indicated by the difference between the baseline box plots median and the shocked box plots median. Additionally, we could see how the United States would perform or other vulnerabilities in the political indicators chart. Here, again, we have a gray box plot indicating the spectrum of capacities and pressures, or rather the distribution of capacities and pressures, if there was no shock applied. And we can observe that if a shock was applied in state legitimacy, the United States would shift farther leftward on the chart, indicating vulnerability in this area. Again, this example rings true in the case of analyzing the United States response in terms of COVID-19 and other political crises and shocks that we've seen in the country in recent years. As you can see, this dashboard can be particularly useful for identifying opportunities to shore up capacities when planning responses to a shock. It's advisable to consult the State Resilience Index and the Fragile States Index dashboards for more granular analysis, as well as our demo video on the website for the State's Resilience Index. Sorry, for the State Resilience Index. You can use these dashboards, as I said, they're up on our website for the public to interact with. And that concludes the demo for today. Back to you, Emily.
Great. Thank you so much to both John and Nate for their explanation of what we are looking at today. Since it is the first time that we are all using this, it is great to have an overview of both systems and the analysis behind it. So thank you to you both. I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce our moderator for our panel. We have an expert panel who has come through to discuss all the different aspects of how this index can be used and how it influences their work potentially going forward. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, who will be introducing our panel. Our moderator today is Don Chisholm, who is the director of the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention at the USAID. And I will be dropping his bio and the bio of all of our speakers into the chat box as they're introduced, so that you have the opportunity to read all about them. Thanks so much, and over to you, Don.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's my privilege to moderate this panel today, because it gives me the opportunity to engage with some very, very accomplished people. So first things first, let me introduce our panel members briefly. And as Emily mentioned, we'll share their bios in the chat box. So first, we have Dr. Malika Glover, an epidemiologist and social scientist. She is the interim executive director for Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, also known as WCAPS. Welcome. We have Ben Valentino, professor of government at Dartmouth College, and also the chair of the Department of Government. Reverend Dr. James Mobile Wuye is a pastor with Assemblies of God and co-executive director of the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, Nigeria. And finally, we have Nate, who's already spoken to us. Nate Haken is the Vice President for Research and Innovation at Fund for Peace. So before we start to engage the panelists, I just wanted to share a little from my perspective about this State Resilience Index from USAID. So we use a strength-based approach to resilience at AID, and this marks a shift away from a focus on fragility and vulnerabilities to one that identifies the strengths, assets, skills, strategies, relationships of people, households, communities, systems, and countries. And so this index is very precisely very precise in its utility for us as we look at our resilience programming. The second thing I wanted to mention is we are on the cusp of sharing for public comments a draft resilience policy in a few weeks. And the first of 7 principles is the need to use evidence and analysis to better understand risks and resilience. All of this is to say that this is very much something that we appreciate and that we welcome in this space. So let's move on to our panelists. First question I'd like to pose to our panelists is, how is this index useful for the work you do, and how will you use the data to further your work? I'll first turn to Malika to address that question.
Sure. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. So from the WCAP's perspective, we believe global issues demand a variety of perspectives. And so that's why we created a platform that was devoted to women of color, that cultivates a strong voice and network for its members, while encouraging dialogue and strategies for engaging in policy discussions on an international scale. Women of color, who are often the most affected by country instability and who are also community leaders in many parts of the world, the 7 pillars of resilience allow for a variety of perspectives and its applicability, and for application more broadly in the fields of international peace, security, and conflict transformation. As an epidemiologist and a social scientist, I'm trained to examine how cultural, economic, and demographic factors, including biopsychological interactions, social influences, and a variety of levels of social organization ranging from small groups to complex cultural systems, influences public health and its delivery. So these pillars fit directly into that discussion. So I understand the direct impact of this index and how it influences the delivery of public health. As an emergency management specialist, I understand far too well how these pillars of resilience impact the ability for communities to be able to return to an acceptable state of being or life as usual after a pandemic, an emergency, a hurricane, whatever, a natural disaster. So from my perspective, in all 3 of those parts of sort of who I am and the roles that I play, these pillars allow for us to implement strategies for intervention, policy development, and inclusion of voice and perspective in terms of managing disasters, peace, security, conflict transformation, and the myriad of things areas that we work in. So from my perspective, the data is helpful to have broader conversations about how state capacity and inclusion, social cohesion, faith, space, civic space, community involvement, economy, how the relationships between the state and locals, all of those things and the data from that allow us to have better conversations and allow us also to make sure that we are inclusive in our perspectives and voices across all of those spaces to be able to apply it towards whatever it is that we're trying to deal with in the community at the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Malika. And would like to probably come back later in the questions to ask a little bit more of some of the sub-pillars, particularly in the health space that you might be dealing with and interested in. Next, I'll turn to Ben to answer the same question from your perch.
Hi, well, glad to be here this morning. I've spent a long time in my career working with these different kinds of lists and indices. I'm a little bit of a watch list junkie, I guess you might say. every year for the past 5 years or so, I've done an analysis of over a dozen lists for the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. I know some of you have been there for some of the presentations of that. I also helped to develop the Early Warning Project list at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which produces a list every year of the states at greatest risk for mass atrocity. So I know and love lists, and always at the top of that list of lists has been the Fragile States Index, which I've found to be one of the most systematic and user-friendly lists out there. So I'm glad to see Fund for Peace is starting another list, which looks to me to be right up to the standards of the Fragile States Index. I thought what I'd do in just my 3 minutes is to try to put the State Resilience Index into a little bit of perspective, part of this kind of broader context of indices and lists, to see where the State Resilience Index fits in, and that'll tell you kind of how it fits into my own work. When I'm talking about these lists to a general audience, the analogy I usually like to use is earthquakes, the analogy to earthquakes. If our goal is to anticipate where earthquakes will cause the most death and destruction, and then by extension, how we might want to minimize the destruction that earthquakes cause, we really want to know about 3 things, and each of these has a direct analogy, I think, to trying to produce a watch list. So first, we want to know where earthquakes are most likely to occur. And of course, that's not that hard to do. The basic geology behind where earthquakes happen is pretty well known. We know they happen on fault lines, and they also tend to happen just in places where they happened in the past. And we know where those places are, places like Japan and California and Peru and Indonesia. And they're not very likely in places like Florida or Sweden. They almost never have earthquakes. And we know that with pretty high confidence. And this is what most watch lists do. I'd say that's what the Fragile States Index and the Early Warning Project watch list do. They identify states that are at some kind of underlying structural risk for violence or other kinds of destabilizing events, whatever those might be, coups, civil wars, mass atrocities. And it turns out that the risk factors for these things, and even the risk factors for some seemingly unrelated sorts of events, things like environmental protection, deaths from pandemics and famines, the basic underlying risk factors are pretty much the same for this very diverse set of crises and destabilizing events. And our lists do a pretty good job of identifying where these things are likely to happen and where not. So we know they're likely to happen in places like Sudan and the DRC, and not very likely in places like Iceland or Japan. Now, of course, although we know that earthquakes are more common in some places than others, they're still really rare. They don't happen every day or even every year, only really big ones once every couple of decades. But we'd really like to know exactly when they're going to happen, because that would allow us to take action, right? If there's a tsunami coming, we need to evacuate the area, get people to higher ground. But this turns out to be a much, much harder task. We know where earthquakes are likely to occur, but we don't know exactly when. Our understanding of the geology is not that specific, and it's hard for us to measure empirically what's going on in the fault lines. And so we can't usually predict exactly when. And again, that's quite similar to what's going on in the general watch lists. We know which countries are likely to have events eventually, but not exactly which year, and certainly not exactly which month that will happen. And I'll just say, that's one reason why I like the crisis sensitivity simulator. Although it doesn't allow us to know when the crisis will hit, it really does let us ask for any individual country, what if a crisis hit in this country? What might be the results? And then finally, and this is where the resilience index really comes in, we don't want to know just where and even when an event will occur. We want to know how bad that event will be for the society in which it occurs. So if an earthquake happens,
even though earthquakes are more likely in California than they are in, say, Haiti, when an earthquake happens in California, it causes many fewer deaths and destruction than it does when it happens in Haiti. And that's because California is more resilient. It has better building codes and a much more robust first responder system to rescue and treat victims of an earthquake that might happen. And again, there's no reason why we couldn't do this in the watch list space, but not very many watch lists have attempted to do that. But I think the resilience index here is one of the first and is doing it really well. And you can see if you go to the list, there are countries like Spain and Northern Ireland, the UK in general, that actually they've had civil wars, they've had major events of terrorism, and yet those events don't explode into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths as they might in countries like the DRC or Syria. And if you go on the list, you can see why that's true. Although those two countries score relatively low in, say, social cohesion, on the other pillars, they're much stronger. And those stronger pillars kind of support the weaker pillars of social cohesion. So I think that's a good indication that the list is doing just what we would hope that it would do. And I hope we can see how understanding this, understanding why it is that some countries can experience shocks and still be resilient, that's really a critical question. Because if we do understand that, we can try to help some of those countries that are less resilient build the institutions and mechanisms to make them look more like the UK and Spain, and again, less like some of those countries that are more likely to descend into real major episodes of instability and violence.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the analogy of the earthquakes, and also as you ended, highlighting the interrelationship of the pillars, because I think that's where the value is for policymakers in determining where resources and strategies and priorities should be built around. Next, I'll turn to James to talk about the question about how the index is useful to you in your work and how you'll use the data from the index to help you with your work. James?
Thank you very much for having me on this. I will start with a salutation that says, peace be with you all. Having been on this program to look at peace issues relating to this fragility index, I bring on board issues relating to freedom, religious freedom and tolerance, and how fatalism takes care of pragmatism. This data that has come forth from this wonderful research that has been conducted, to me will be a data that we can use in our large constituency. What is this constituency? Constituency of religious leaders. As I speak now, somewhere in the middle of Abuja, where I'm talking to religious leaders from 10 countries of Africa. And how will this document, how will this index, how will this tool be beneficial to them? How do we manage shock? Like I have always said, in the religious sphere, some of us do not believe in pragmatism, but in fatalism, meaning passing the buck to the creator. Having seen what is happening, we will give it to say, that is what the creator has wished. But how do we take pragmatic steps in order to ameliorate the challenges that come and shock that comes with some of these issues that happen? They could be man-made, they could be natural. And to me here, I see that in times of prognosis and planning for African solution, I think within the context of our values and culture, there are certain things that we as people of faith can bring on board to address this matter. So this information, this data, this dashboard will come in as a solution to one of the things that we have lacked over the years. Religious leaders participating, cultural leaders participating, traditional leaders participating, getting to the roots. Recently, there was flooding in Nigeria, which is an ecological related issue. How did we manage it? Where did we go from? it was all done by community initiative to look at how to address these issues that are coming. Sometimes we have forecasts, we know they are coming, but we say, oh no, the Almighty God will take it away. No, it is not about the Almighty God taking away these things, but how have we done pragmatically? So I see that pillar on ecology. I see that pillar on economy. I see that pillar on societal initiative to promote peace and to promote those issues that we are seeing as challenges coming very handy. To me, it's a gift. It's a big gift that Fund for Peace is giving to humanity on this data. And we can put it side by side with what we have. And one niche we have, and I'm sure will help to propagate this, is that we have a platform. This platform meets every week. Some traditional leaders meet every day. Religious leaders meet on Friday and Saturdays and Sundays. And whatever we want to do, how to come together to do this collective engagement of community to embark on responses will be quite apt and quite useful. To me, I also see that this data will also help greatly to galvanizing and catalyzing for pragmatic solutions to issues that have been raised. What Benjamin has just spoken cuts across quite a lot of things. But when we use what I title divine intimidation responses, coupled with the human responses, then we are able to address the shock. We are able to pass the buck to our creator. But what do we do on our own? For me, this document quite handy, and we are using all these things to see how can we superimpose on our faith, on our script, issues of motivation towards quick action. And when there are shocks, I have seen the practice over the years is that communities come together in clusters within faith tradition to help each other. And except during the pandemic, when people were suffering, places, houses were closed, community collected certain things together to help those who are the most vulnerable. I want to say, for this research that has been done, a big thank you. And it will be very useful in our work. And we have the platform to escalate this quickly. And I'm quite sure that we will be granted that freedom and permission to begin to work on this. And if allowed, even here where I'm staying, I will want to share it with those religious leaders representing 10 African countries that are gathered here in Abuja to say, new tool has come, use it to save the world. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate your focus. The phrases I heard you use were pragmatic steps and pragmatic solutions. So I really appreciate your focus in taking this information and then trying to figure out how to work with it and how to improve the communities within which you work. I'm going to turn to Malika for the next question. In general, what have been the challenges that you've seen with data and evidence in this resilient space, and how have these challenges evolved?
Yes, I would say that in general, from the perspective of public health, from emergency management, from the perspective that Reverend James shared, which I very much appreciate, I think many of the challenges come with trying to explain to the world outside of which you work all of the pieces that are involved in successfully, moving a community in a direction of either better health, recovery from a pandemic, recovery from a disaster such as an earthquake. And it's hard for legislature, it's hard for the government. Oftentimes it's hard for folks that are not in that space to understand the intersectionality of all of the things that make a community what it is, including the people, including the culture, including the history, including the environment, including the space, all of those things. So from my perspective, the challenges really fall in the realm of really explaining that people are multifaceted. We have different parts of us. Communities are multifaceted. There's different economies going on across communities that might reside very close to each other and are trying to work together. And of course, being able to explain that to be able to get support, be it funded, funding or whatever the case may be, you really have to try to sort of figure out how to meet that person where they are so that they can sort of translate their perspective and sort of the space they live in, to be able to understand how to provide assistance and not help at the end of the day. And so from my perspective, that has been the biggest challenge. Public health is tremendously underfunded, mainly because there's this notion that it doesn't cost as much as it does. And most of that is because, you know, where the money comes from has not been sort of adequately convinced, or just are not on board with the concept that if you take care of things in the beginning and prepare people in the beginning and keep people healthy in the beginning, they will cost you less at the end of the day. So if you have a resilient community, if you have a community that is actively involved from a civic space society, that there are strengthened individual capabilities, that they have, you know, a strong economy locally, they can be able to bounce back from a scenario better if they are, you know, relying on their faith and have a strong community from that perspective. They are better prepared to respond when negative things or shocks happen. And so it's really hard for people to sort of grasp that concept and put their hands on it because they want something tangible. So I find that that is the biggest issue, I think, and barrier to using data sometimes often in these spaces, because it's not tangible to people who are often outside of that space. But what I appreciate about this index is that I think it involves so many areas, that there are allies that are in each of these spaces that I think we could rely on and reach out to, who understand the perspective of each of these pillars, who are able to at least say, okay, so from this perspective, I understand what you're saying about how this particular piece impacts the community's ability to sort of, you know, bounce back from a shock. And this is how I can, you know, provide support in this space. So I think that it broadens our reach from that perspective of allyship and being able to get support to communities, to countries, to societies, to be able to manage shocks going forward. So that has been my experience from both the perspective of public health, from emergency management, and also from the perspective of marginalized communities. It's just that the folks on the outside don't understand all of these pieces that are involved in being able to be strong and withstand sort of external influence and changes.
Yeah, that's a good point, Malika. I mean, I think your comments really resonated with me. The intersectionality of it all. I mean, being in a large bureaucracy, we have a natural tendency to silo all of our different sectors, and this is something that really cuts across all of them. And the index presents the information in a way that makes it obvious that this isn't related simply to one sector, but that specific sectors are very much tied into other aspects of a society's resilience as well. Thanks. I'm going to pose the same question to Nate. Nate, in general, what have been the challenges that you've seen with this data, and how have these challenges evolved?
Thank you so much. Yes, so there is an inherent tension between developing a global index while also recognizing that context is king. And we're talking about resilience. We're really talking about context, right? Social cohesion looks different in one country than it does in another. So that makes it kind of tricky to develop a sort of a generalizable index when we're talking about something that really depends on localization and local context to really understand how resilience expresses itself in one place versus another. For example, social cohesion may look very different in one country than in another country. So that really makes us feel the need to be very humble about this index. You know, we're starting off now, and we want to make sure that we're learning, that we're constantly learning. We'll see how it holds up over time, but ultimately, I'm very adamant about continuing to build dynamic simulations that then frame structured dialogue with country experts, instead of just relying on the scores themselves and the ranks themselves across the pillars and the sub-pillars to really sort of be the end of the analysis. That's really the beginning of the analysis, and we really want to make sure that, given the fact that there is this tension between between developing sort of a generalizable index on the one hand in a very dynamic space that requires local context for proper interpretation and application on the other. We need to have that ability to be very dynamic in our analysis and interpretation of the tool. So we talk about challenges. That's kind of how I see a pretty fundamental challenge in terms of this entire project.
Thanks, Nate. And while you have the mic, I'm just going to ask you something that popped up from one of our audience participants. Could you provide more information on the data sources for the indicators?
Yeah, so as John mentioned, there are 190 different metrics. Those metrics are measured with a lot of public documents like World Bank and WHO and development reports and surveys and things that we map to the various pillars and sub-pillars. But the real trick is in the modeling. So, scaling and applying different weights and aggregating in different ways. And as I mentioned, that's, in terms of how everything is different from one country to the other, it's also different from one indicator and pillar to the other. So that's pretty tricky. Every indicator needs to be treated differently. So how we weight and aggregate those metrics is where things are, I guess, tricky in the development of the framework.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Ben, I'm going to pull you in on that. The question on data and evidence in the resilient space. What are the challenges that you've seen as the person who keeps an eye on all of these lists, and how have these challenges evolved?
Well, I think there are, as I see it, really two main challenges, and they're not unique to a list on resilience. I think they apply to virtually every warning or indicator or watch list that's out there, or index. And so there are two. And the first one is the real need to go down below the state level to the local level. So we've all had, anyone who's worked with these lists has had the experience of seeing that a country like Sudan or India or Myanmar has a high risk. But each of those countries, anyone who knows anything about them knows there are half a dozen or more kind of fault lines where that risk might manifest. And those could be in completely different parts of the country, literally hundreds or thousands of miles separated over completely different issues. And when we see that a country is at high risk or conversely has a lot of resilience, we don't know whether that applies equally to all those places. We don't know whether it's just as resilient to a shock that occurs in one part of the country or in one type of conflict than it might in another. So we really need that data. It's a really hard problem because almost all the data sources we use are not collecting at the local level. But I do think, and I'll say this is true for the second thing too, so I'll hold off. I think there are some promising avenues, changes in technology that are allowing us to get at this more in the future. The second place where there are real challenges in the data is, as I said in my presentation, when we're talking about earthquakes, we really want to know not just where they're going to happen, but exactly when. That's really important for us to know. And the same for crises and violent events and general instability. Want to know in a more defined period of time when it's going to happen. And we don't have the kind of data that would allow us to do that. For most of our lists, again, just because of the way the data is gathered, the data that goes into those lists is usually at least a year out of date by the time that we get it. Most of these lists are only updated on an annual basis anyway. So even if we could have data that was more discrete in time, it wouldn't matter. It's not incorporated into the list. And so we need to have that more real-time data, real-time monitoring that can go into these lists, so that we can make forecasts that are not out a year or more in advance, but really help us understand
what about next month or even next week? Is something going to happen? So for a long time, we've just, although people have recognized these problems, there hasn't been much we could do about it. The task of assembling this data for over 100 countries at the local level on a weekly basis. Imagine the number of observations one has to be on top of for dozens or even hundreds of indicators. It's a task that might be beyond any human organization. However, if those of you who've been following the news lately have seen, there's been some real advances in machine learning and machine coding technologies that allow us, and I've done some work on these myself, to tap into things like local news sources and using machine algorithms to pull out data that's interesting and valuable to us, and that could then become inputs into these kind of lists. And I think kind of proof of concept, we're already there, but no one has really attempted to do this on a fully global basis and then really test it out to see whether those data can be externally validated. In other words, whether they really do provide good warning or not. But I think that's the cutting edge of where we are and probably the way forward on a number of the data problems that we face in this kind of endeavor.
That's interesting. I know USAID has been looking at machine learning in terms of understanding local news, but you raised a good point at the need for external validation to see to what extent this is actually going to be an effective approach, but very, very interesting comments. I'll turn to James for the next question. James, how can this tool be localized through partnership, particularly for peace building in the field? This is a question from an audience member.
Thank you very much. From our experience, having worked with NET, hacking back in some years where capacity of locals were raised on how to identify early warnings in various thematic areas and how to respond to those things, collaborating with state actors and sometimes non-state actors, local structures within communities, and how to respond using local initiatives like an African answer to African problems, having gotten information and data that have been generated. We saw the trend during the COVID pandemic, where issues around gender-based violence increased because people are staying together who have hitherto had not stayed together for a long time because of the workspace where they work. Families got to know each other. And within that period, there were escalation of various types of violences. Now, people were not ready for that. But with what we have now as an information, early response is possible. How do we watch out for ecological related early response? What happens? What about movement of herdsmen and farmers' challenges around Africa? What time does it heighten? What do we do as a people to avoid? So this information will give us the capacity to analyze trending issues. And it is also very important at this point because of the level of understanding on how to analyze data. What has been given here has simplified the work. And so what do we do with this? Is to train for the people on the ground, local people, to begin to understand how to apply this data. So for me, clustering around traditional leaders, faith leaders, using this material to forecast, using these materials to know when these things are coming. And what to do. Back, let me know somebody has interrupted my my data. But what I'm saying, if I'm back, is to say local people can use these materials for forecasting, for prevention, and for pragmatism. For me, like I did say, there is what you will use local values to escalate actions, and you get actions within a short time. Like if you say to people of faith, let's have green salmons to prevent us from destroying the ecology, and let's have green days where we can plant peace trees. That's one pragmatic section on the ecology. So people will come together and say, this is the trend, this is the rate of duplication of our desert, and how do we do? People will come under faith to work together and join hands. And we have what to use to motivate them. So locally, I think this is quite up, and it's a useful tool that we can reach thousands and millions of people within a short time. If we give a declaration on the faces of our tradition, both people of different faiths can use it all over in Asia, in Malaysia, Asia, in Africa, in the United States, under the collaboration of Religion for Peace. We can send this message quite quickly out into the world.
Well, thank you, James. And I think that you would be in the vanguard of that effort, given the network that you have and the platform that you have. So it'd be very interesting in the future to see how you can operationalize some of this information. Malika, I'm going to ask you the same question. How can this tool be localized through partnership from your perspective, particularly for peace building?
Yes, thank you. I actually resonate quite a bit with the Reverend James' comments about peace building and really sort of engaging at the community level from a local perspective, because I think that's really where the action is going to happen. And that's really where the forward movement is going to be. And so, you know, from the perspective of women, peace, and security, there's a lot of conversation and partnership in the areas of civic engagement and civic involvement. It really is going to take those at the local level and those community leaders and to be the ones that are going to push the agenda forward in the space of peace building. They are the ones that live there. They are the ones that are, you know, in the day-to-day of what it means to be peaceful. Like, what is peace building in their community and how to get there. They have the history. They have the longevity of thought and understanding about the people that live in that space. So from my perspective, that is sort of like where we stand when we're working with other organizations and our partners on in the space of women, peace, and security. It is that allyship with civic society and the government. That it's really important to have. Benjamin spoke about state versus local. From the perspective of sort of public health, one of the things I always say is we don't get anything done without the locals. We need them to get anything done, period. And so trying to sort of go in as a federal entity or whatever the case may be, hi, we're here to help, that never works. It's never effective. It doesn't really sort of forge a really positive relationship. And so when it comes to the space of peace building, that whole local involvement, that civic engagement, that community led. So it's not also just about like having those voices at the table. It really is about being community led, that their voices are the ones that are directing what it is that you're doing and how you're moving peace building forward.
Thanks, Mike. And that's actually the very type of message that we operate on in AID as well. That's become a really important part of our approach to programming in our missions. Nate, I'm going to turn to you for the next questions. There's actually two questions from the audience. I'm going to bundle them together. The first one is, how did you come up with these pillars that constitute a nation's resilience? And are there any that you would add or change going forward? And the second question is, what role did gender play in the development of the index? And how do you believe gender perspectives can influence our understanding of resilience?
Great questions. Thank you very much. So developing these pillars, this, as I mentioned at the beginning, we were really trying to figure out what were we missing. The Fragile States Index for the last 17 years, we've been looking at pressures and shocks and kind of seeing the the prevalence and intensity of these pressures and shocks, but it was clearly, as Dr. Valentino said, it was, it's useful for mapping susceptibility to crisis, but it doesn't do much to tell you how you're going to perform if that crisis hits. So we needed to figure out what we were missing. And so we started thinking about what resilience is, and also thinking about development. So development is, usually ostensibly about trying to promote resilience, but ultimately it usually tends to focus on creating the greatest good for the greatest number in the most efficient way possible. And that's all, of course, very, very good and very important, but you can do so at the expense of resilience, because if the focus is on scale, you miss things like redundancy and networks and context and relationships and decentralization, all of which is not really very efficient. So we can't, while efficiency is important, you can't be efficient at the expense of resilience, because if you tend towards sort of a top-down, turnkey, standardized approach, so that you can reach a whole bunch of people really fast with services or whatever, but that in doing so you undermine local systems. You open yourself up to real vulnerability if you receive a direct shock in that area. So that's kind of the question we were trying to ask ourselves. What is it that we need to look at? And so that's why we started looking at things like social cohesion and environmental resilience and and economy, but not just through the lens of macroeconomy, but through the lens of like diversification and access to finance and things like that. Those were the questions we were trying to ask and answer, and that's how we came up with the pillars. In terms of gender, that is mainstream throughout each of the pillars. I don't think you can see it on the dashboard itself, but each one of those pillars has a subset of metrics which are explicitly focused on engendering each one of those pillars. So in thinking about where this tool might go in the future, perhaps we could disaggregate that out so that people could see more explicitly that gender mainstreaming. But hope that answers the question.
Thanks, and I like the articulation of this tension between efficiency and resilience. I think it's an important point that Food for Peace has made in other documents. I think it's well worth remembering. I'm going to throw a question open to the panel. It's trying to understand the distinction between stressors and shocks. The question is, what about countries who are at risk not from shocks, but from long-lasting crises such as long COVID, or other health risks, ongoing or recurring civil wars, extreme ideologies, environmental decay, or I would add the weak delivery of public services? How is both fragility and resilience assessed in indices compared to shock scenarios? Does anyone want to try to take a stab at that question?
I can maybe take a little stab at it. When we talk about stressors, we think about kind of ongoing pressure. And then when we think about shocks, we think about a sudden change, a sudden worsening in those pressures. So if you look at our crisis sensitivity simulator, you've got sort of a stock of pressure that's built into the baseline. But then if you shock it with a sharp worsening in any of those 12 FSI indicators, then you can see how that might affect the stability of a country. And what we've certainly found is that there's a big difference between a shock and a pressure, because countries may evolve mechanisms by which to sustain and manage pressure, but that shock even if a country already has, enormous pressure, like, some countries have managed, to host, large numbers of migrants for many, many, many years. And then if there's a sudden change in that number or a sudden change in the situation, it changes the situation completely. So it's important to be able to make that distinction between the pressures on the one hand, which countries may have evolved, mechanisms and systems of resilience, and that against how much harder it is to manage a shock. So if a country doesn't have very many pressures and it receives a shock, even if the overall FSI score, for instance, doesn't change much, that sharp worsening, even within a lower bandwidth, can be very destabilizing.
Thanks, Nate. A follow-up question on this issue for Ben. Ben, have you seen this distinction play out across other indices?
Yeah, I was actually just going to comment on that. Again, going back to the earthquake analogy, which maybe I'm overusing, but always works for me in these contexts. So again, these kind of stressors are the things we know about that exist underneath the ground at all times in certain places. And they don't tell us, exactly when something's going to suddenly change, but we kind of know that they're there. It's not that hard to see them. They're often visible, and like I said, they have tended to cause bad events in the past. So usually we can just look at those places that have had some bad events in the past and suspect that that's an indication that bad events might occur in the future, but it doesn't tell us exactly when or exactly what that event might be. And the one thing I'll point out where the earthquake analogy kind of gets overstrained, but it's important here to see this distinction, is that when it comes to earthquakes, your underlying risk for them is generally exogenous. In other words, it's just what's happening under the ground. People don't control the likelihood that there will be a major earthquake in that area. You built a city, maybe you decided not to build it in the worst earthquake areas, but generally looking at the places where we built some big cities doesn't look that way. It's pretty exogenous. Whereas in the space of instability and large-scale violence, these two things tend to go hand in hand. In other words, countries that are vulnerable to shocks also tend to have more of them. It's not just that, so like I said before, you can imagine an earthquake in San Francisco, that would be terrible, but not nearly as bad as the similar earthquake in a place like Haiti. But there's nothing that either country can do to make the earthquakes more or less likely. Whereas in the real world of political instability and violence, there is. And the countries that tend to be more resilient to shocks have often also done the kinds of things and built the kinds of institutions that make those shocks less likely to happen in the first place. And so you tend to see a correlation, probably a stronger one than you would see with earthquakes, between things like the Fragile States Index and this Resilience Index, because again, they're not causally different. They're different, but they're not identical, but they have connections in a way that maybe more physical processes like an earthquake don't have. And that's important to know.
Thanks, Ben. I also wanted to thank all the panelists, Malika, and Reverend James, and Nate as well. It's been a pretty rich discussion for me. I've really enjoyed hearing your insights from perspectives that are completely different. Look forward in the future to see how, as both James and Malika pointed out, how this helps the work at the local level with local actors who are the ones actually in this space trying to affect this type of change. Thanks, everyone. Particularly the audience. Those are some really good questions that really help us unpack a little bit more of these issues. And I will turn it back over to Emily now.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you so much again to the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and to everyone who shared their time and expertise with us today. And I would also like to just once more thank all of the authors who joined us in writing the report, which will be published today as well. So do keep an eye out for that. We will be sending that around to our listserv and everyone who attended the event today. So you will see that one more time. You will see an email from us one more time on this in this week, and then hopefully you will see quite a bit more on this in the upcoming year as we continue to grow and evolve this index over the next iterations. And with that, I want to go ahead and close the session today. I would like to invite George Leonard to come back and close our session for this index.
Thanks, Emily. Again, thanks to all for participating. Let me just say briefly that I think this is really only the beginning of a conversation. If we've done nothing else, we are trying to open a dialogue here to create a conversation among the broad community, the ecosystem, as Vilas Dar said, of peace builders around the world. I think everybody who's participated today is already a part of that ecosystem. And I would really challenge everybody to extend your network and to bring them into this conversation as we go forward, and to really use this tool in the best way that you know how, to practice using it, to introduce it to friends, to learn from it, and to help us learn going forward as well. So thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to being part of that conversation with you in the future. So again, thank you again to everybody who has participated today.
And with that, I will make sure that the link to the dashboard is in the chat for anyone who wants to go and take this opportunity to explore. And with that, I will end our session with one more thanks to Don for moderating, all of our panelists, and for everyone who asked questions. We will be capturing those questions to keep working on this index. Thank you all and have a great day.